We've talked about services deliberately abstracting the internal operations of business capabilities. And when we specify services, we're trying to stay focused on the overall value proposition for the customer. But a process perspective is just as important to the service provider. And this section will look at the provider as a system and make sure we understand processes as well as services. Then we'll be able to understand how USM's process model works. I mentioned in USM's long journey that USM began with a focus on systems theory, so let's start there. All service providers have three fundamental assets: people, processes, and tools or technology. And this framework hasn't changed in more than half a century, and as Forbes stated, it remains a go-to model. To ensure services are predictable, the service organization uses standardized routines that integrate people, process, and tools or technology. These routines come in various forms and include processes, procedures, and work instructions. So, for the provider to be in control of their services, they must be in control of their assets and their routines. Russell Ackoff was a pioneer in systems thinking. Let's hear a short clip on what he had to say about this.
A system is a whole that contains two or more parts, each of which can affect the properties or behavior of the whole. For example, you are a system, a biological system called an organism, and you have parts like your heart, stomach, lungs, pancreas, and so on, each of which can affect your properties and your behavior. The second requirement of the parts of a system is that none of them has an independent effect on the whole. How any part affects the whole depends on what other parts are doing. So the way your heart affects you depends on the behavior of the lungs, the brain, and so on. The parts are all interconnected. Between any two parts of a system, there's a direct or an indirect path. And finally, if you group the parts of a system into subgroups, no matter how you subgroup them, each subgroup will have an effect on the properties and the behavior of the whole, and none will have an independent effect. And therefore, you can summarize those three characteristics of a system into a simple statement: a system is a whole that cannot be divided into independent parts. Now, this has a number of consequences which are not apparent but are incredibly important. The first is the essential properties of any system derive out of how its parts interact, not on how they act taken separately. And therefore, the defining properties of any system are properties of the whole, which none of its parts have.
What this means is that in order to be in control, and our routines are integrating people, processes, and tools or technologies, then we must be in control of our routines. And this leads us into understanding how the USM method views processes in addition to services. Now, before we get to the USM process model, it's important to understand USM's perspective of process. Since we've been analyzing processes for over half a century, there's at least as much confusion around process as there is around services. So it's important to really understand what I like to call the process river. Most people will agree on the basic process model as shown here: a logical series of activities with an input or trigger and a predetermined output or outcome. And of course, under control, so you're sure that the output or outcome is achieved. But we tend to call any stream of related activity a process, and this can make actually identifying processes difficult. Now, here's a link to what I thought was an excellent white paper which talks about this, and the author has a lot of free resources on his site. But please be sure and read his terms. He only asks that they be used for personal use only, unless you get his permission to use them commercially. Here's an excerpt from this paper. Picture yourself standing by the side of a shallow stream In your hands are two stakes. You wade out into the stream and drive one stake into the bed of the stream. And you say to yourself, the process starts or ends here. Now you wade downstream or upstream 50 feet or so and drive the second stake into the bed of the stream, saying to yourself, the process ends or starts here. Now you're not fooled, right? The process doesn't start or end where you've driven the stakes into the stream bed. At best, you've marked a portion of the stream for study or manipulation or some other purpose. And the same is true when we drive stakes into the stream bed of organizational activity as a way of defining business processes. When different practice frameworks use the term process, they may or may not always agree on these process boundaries. But adapting multiple practices in an enterprise is even more difficult than agreeing on where processes begin and end. Remember, a process perspective sharpens the understanding for the operational model of a business capability. But the more we decompose activities, the more complex they become, and the risk for adding waste and redundancy actually increases. When we decompose processes, we get deeper and deeper into the operational analysis. And so the process river has depths as well. We can change the labels to anything we want, but the deeper we dive, the more detailed process analysis gets. In 1992, the process classification framework identified pure process as right in the middle of this process river. And so the analysis of related activities could take place at any level you wanted, from high-level business categories to detailed work instructions. And we'd have labels for the different depths of the analysis. But the truth is, we still tend to call everything at every level a process today. USM has established process design criteria that helps differentiate between pure processes and other work streams at lower levels of the process classification framework. By using these design criteria, the USM method has created a non-redundant process model for service management. What's important to understand is that the practice frameworks combine process, activities, and tasks, or what USM would label process, procedures, and work instructions. And these are the routines we talked about. And the practices combine the people, process, and tools, or the what, the who, and the how of our routines or practices. So the practice frameworks decompose process analysis into great detail, which is why this guidance is so popular. But in practice, people will almost always focus on specifying routines at a type of procedure and work instruction level. And of course, they still call them processes, even though IDLE now refers to them as practice areas. So practices can quickly emerge and evolve, but they were never derived from an underlying generic process model. And as a result, the practices lack structural compatibility with other practices within the organization. And as we apply more and more practices, we create a complexity that soon becomes unmanageable. If we look at the three assets of a service provider, we can illustrate how routines are developed. At a process level, we identify what we do. It specifies only the activities. Then we need to determine who is going to do what. And at that point, we have a procedure, which specifies the activities and the operators. And finally, we decide how that operator will accomplish the what. And these are work instructions, which include the activities, the operators, and the technical instructions. So routines are derived from processes. Practice guidance gives us plenty of detail. In fact, a detailed practice is basically a work instruction. But the question remains, how do we get all service teams to cooperate in a sustainable way? Well, of course, we apply the USM method to establish a unified service management system. Now, but we've already said that practice frameworks that are suitable for IT may not be suitable for HR or for finance. In fact, each facilitating discipline will want to leverage practices that are localized to their specific needs. We also said that an enterprise service management strategy must be based on cooperation, and this requires integration, which in turn requires at least some degree of standardization. But different groups within the organization and different service teams in the service supply chain will not only want to leverage different practices, but they'll also have different organizational topologies and different tooling requirements. So how are we all going to get along? Let's briefly discuss the other assets of the provider, namely people and tools or technology. There's no question that work is changing today and will continue to change. While we still see traditional hierarchical structures, matrix organizations are promoting more dynamic roles, and radical enterprises are going to leverage dynamic roles as a core principle. But these are not either-or choices. Some roles and job descriptions or functions will continue to be well-established, consistent, and relatively unchanging over time, while others are flexible and adaptable in response to changes in the organization's goals, strategies, and external factors. USM connects the process and people dimensions through the use of profiles. A profile is a specific combination of tasks, authorities, and responsibilities that are assigned to an employee and are supplemented with the skills and knowledge to perform the required tasks. As long as the employee has a defined profile, the organizational topology doesn't matter. USM accommodates any organizational topology, hierarchical, matrix, squads and tribes, even radical enterprises. The people domain is loosely coupled in the USM routines, as we'll see in the next section when we review the USM process model and standard workflows. USM provides similar flexibility in the use of tooling. As the enterprise leverages technologies such as AI and robotic process automation, different parts of the organization will have different tooling requirements. So the generic and specific tooling for each domain may vary, and USM accommodates this. What USM seeks to standardize is the administration of the USM workflows and the managed infrastructure repository, or what's more popularly called the CMDB. As AI and RPA accelerate change at the upper and lower ends of the process classification framework, the middle-level processes become the linchpin for effective integration. These mid-level processes are the critical link between the business category level and the instructions for robotic process automation at the procedure and work instruction levels. Complex, non-standard processes can hinder AI performance, and successful RPAs based on standardized procedures and work instructions. The USM method and its non-redundant process model accommodate these requirements. All right, so let's wrap up section 3 with a quick review. All providers have 3 basic assets: people, process, and tools or technology. Processes are not the same is practices. Processes describe what we do. Procedures describe what we do and who does what. Work instructions describe what we do, who does it, and how they do it. USM uses profiles to connect the people and process domains. Service management tooling should focus on workflow management and an infrastructure register, or CMDB, if you prefer that term. The USM Awareness Workshop is led by an authorized USM coach and can be used in several different ways depending on an organization's circumstances. It can help evaluate the feasibility of USM for an organization. It can be used during the planning phase of a USM deployment or to prepare the organization for a USM improvement sprint. Contact me for more information.